Won't you be my neighbor? This was a song and a phrase used by Mr. Rogers, an ordained Presbyterian minister who believed that his call was to minister to children via the television medium. Through this call, Mr. Rogers, or Reverend Fred Rogers, felt he was sharing the gospel with children. And through these many ways, through the land of make-believe, feeding his fish, Mr. Rogers had this gentle way about him, his gentle way of speaking to children without being condescending. And his manner was very quiet and very calming. In fact, when I was growing up, my mom would often put on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood because sometimes it was the only thing that would calm us kids down right before dinner. His voice, his way of being, his sweaters, his stories, his way of explaining, won't you be my neighbor? And Mr. Rogers taught and ministered and preached in his own unique way. And I also offer that Mr. Rogers pushed us as viewers, as children, to think about what loving neighbor looks like. And Mr. Rogers often did this in and with the most seemingly mundane ways. So, for example, think of a swimming pool, one of those kiddie swimming pools. You may have had one growing up. Your kids or your grandkids may have had one, just one of those circular plastic swimming pools. One of those things that seems ordinary and mundane. But there's a story, a Mr. Rogers, a Reverend Fred Rogers story, which explains the depth of what it means to love one's neighbor. Francois Clemens tells us this story about one of those very small plastic swimming pools that Mr. Rogers used to explain how to love your neighbor. Mr. Clemens lived in Pittsburgh, and he met Fred Rogers at a church in that same city. After their meeting, Mr. Rogers asked Mr. Clemens if he would be interested in a reoccurring role as a police officer on the Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood television show. At first, Mr. Clemens was not really thrilled with this idea. He didn't think that he should be able to take it. And he was really nervous about accepting this role because in the past he had had trouble with the Pittsburgh Police Department. In a National Public Radio StoryCorps episode aired last year, Mr. Clemens, a descendant of sharecroppers, clarified his experience this way. I grew up in the ghetto. I did not have positive experience with cops. So Mr. Clemens wasn't sure he wanted to portray one on TV. But after watching one episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and seeing the gentle, kind way in which Fred Rogers ministered, yet spoke the truth of love, Mr. Clemens decided he would, in fact, join the cast. And he became Officer Clemens. And he made history. He was the first Black American to have a reoccurring character on a children's television show. This was a role that Mr. Clemens played for 25 years. A role which taught children of all ages, from 1 to 100, what it means to love your neighbor. One particular episode where Mr. Rogers and Officer Clemens showed they loved their neighbor and showed how to love your neighbor in a seemingly simplistic yet profound way on May 9th, 1969. In this episode, the character, Officer Clemens, was out on his beat. It was a hot summer day, and when he had reached Mr. Rogers' house, Officer Clemens stumbled upon a Mr. Rogers who had his feet in the cool water of a plastic kiddie swimming pool. Mr. Rogers then noticed Officer Clemens and how hot he was. So Mr. Rogers invited Officer Clemens to come into his backyard, take off his shoes and socks, and join Mr. Rogers with his feet also planted in that cool, refreshing water. This was a radical act. Loving our neighbor sometimes can be a very radical yet gentle act. Because in this scene, when Mr. Clemens was done, Mr. Rogers, as Jesus did with his disciples, took Officer Clemens' feet and wiped them dry with a towel. Think about Pittsburgh in the late 1960s and how profound that kindness would have been. Washing the feet of another human being, showing you love your neighbor in simple, kind, and radical ways. This is the subtle servanthood that Jesus taught us to do and to be and to live into. This act of love by Mr. Rogers was also in contrast with what was going on across the country. White people were not supposed to share space with black people. Just a few years before, in 1964, remember this episode aired in 1969. In 1964, at the Moden Motor Lodge, a whites-only hotel with a whites-only pool became part of history. This was part of a larger protest from Martin Luther King Jr. He, like Mr. Rogers, reminds us that each in our own way, each of us in our own way, live out that meaning of Protestant, to protest the status quo that is not working for everyone. Earlier in the day at this lodge, Reverend Dr. King expressed his love of neighbor and the unjustness and the unfairness when he attempted to eat at the hotel restaurant, but he was turned away because of the color of his skin. This rejection led to another planned event, or what is sometimes called an action. This was done to help remind people that they were separating themselves from that which is God-like and that which is loving your neighbor. So in that evening of 1964, after Dr. King had been kicked out of the restaurant, white allies rented rooms, and then they and the black protesters went outside and jumped in the pool. Remember, this was a whites-only pool, a whites-only hotel. They were all in the pool water swimming when the hotel manager, James Brock, came out, and in his anger, he poured muriatic acid into the pool. Now, there wasn't enough acid to really cause physical harm, The chemical dissipated into the water once it was actually dumped in there. But yes, Mr. Brock poured acid into the pool water that day. Why? The words he spoke as he committed his action might give us a clue. Purify. 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 You see, Mr. Brock felt that he needed to purify the pool from the black people who were swimming in it. Mr. Brock may not have caused physical harm by pouring acid into the pool, but he certainly forgot how to love his neighbor. So when we move forward a couple of years to 1969 and we see on national television a children's program, a white man sharing a kiddie pool with a black man. Mr. Rogers, he was one who taught us to follow the commandment to love our neighbor. To love our neighbor in ways of sharing physical spaces, and to love our neighbor through this miracle called water. Water is essential to humankind. We are made up of water. Evolution tells us we are made out of water, and yes, water purifies us, but it is not a purification meant to separate each other and separate ourselves from God. It is meant as a way to bring us together, to love each other, to love our neighbor. Our ancestors in faith recognized this. Purifying, washing oneself with water, baptizing oneself was part of the religious tradition that John the Baptist and Jesus were birthed into. It is in their sacred texts. In Genesis, the flood waters cleansed the earth. In Leviticus chapter 8, verse 6, tells us that Moses bathed Aaron before Aaron's ordination into priesthood. And Leviticus chapter 14, verse 8, gives us the reminder that when one becomes ill or sick, you stayed out of the community until you were cleansed. For cleansing was not only what you did before you entered the temple. Cleansing and baptizing is what you did to become part of and to come back to community. Come back to the groups of neighbors. This is a cleanliness that becomes a way of welcoming yourself, of welcoming others back into the neighborhood, back into the community. Washing oneself with that power of water. For water is a miracle that binds us all together. All humans are born from the water in the womb. And when we're baptized, we are gifted into Christian community, a community who is commanded to love our neighbor, a community who is directed to share that sacred element called water with all. A cleansing with water, a sharing with water, removes what helps keep us broken and helps us reconnect with God and with each other. When we remember to love our neighbor, when we let go of that fear and that anger, we can sit in a kiddie pool with each other and honoring each other. There is hope. There is hope through water that we love our neighbors. We create community. For the day after the protest that happened in that pool, the day after that action, the day after that person showed his anger and forgot to love his neighbor, the Civil Rights Act was passed in Congress. It had been languishing there in Congress, but was brought forward. It was brought forward as an expression of loving neighbor. Community in the water. Whether by Mr. Rogers and Officer Clement's subversive act, or by the act of protesters in a pool in Florida, or whenever we share in the miracle of water and the blessings of water with others, we are brought closer to that which we call God. I am reminded myself this morning of Mr. Rogers. His widow died this week. And I, at this time, invite everyone to take a deep breath and remember, if you ever watched Mr. Rogers or learned from Mr. Rogers, are reminded that you are loved from Mr. Rogers. To sit in that memory for a moment. This week I remind us how water connects us all, how water is an important part of community. I invite you now to pour water into a bowl or into a plate. Put your hand in. Feel the water around your fingers. Think of the mundane, everyday ways we show we love our neighbors. All of the ways in which we show kindness, unconditional love, and which we show grace. I invite you to sit for a moment. Imagine this water that is universally connects us all. We are sharing this with others. No matter our backgrounds, our religion, our gender identity, the color of our skin. We are all part of this world. We are all part of each other. Won't you be my neighbor?